Our first panel, Mr. Ryland and Mr. Fadden. Before I start, colleagues, we've had a couple of curves thrown at us in terms of our agenda going forward, and we need to give the clerks and the analysts some instructions. So the meeting of the subcommittee was scheduled to start at 5:30. However, bells may be ringing at 5:30, in which case I would be not able to start the subcommittee meeting. Yeah, well, that's you're running a little tight at 5:29, but I was thinking more like 5:20. So we may end at 5:20, or we can stretch it a bit to 5:25. So unless there is other considerations, I'll call upon our colleague, or our witnesses to speak in no particular order, although I take note that Mr. Fadden has spoken at this committee many times, and Mr. Ryland, I believe this is your first opportunity.
Yes.
So maybe I should let the pro go first, and then you'll see how an excellent witness can make a presentation. So, Mr. Fadden, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'll hold you to that assessment when I'm finished.
Don't put it to a vote.
Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you. I want to note as I start that in discussions with the clerk and the staff of the committee, I told them that I wasn't an expert on the financial sector. And it was suggested to me that I could make some general comments on national security and cyber, so that's what I'm proposing to do, and I hope that will be helpful to the committee. I wanted to just comment in an odd sort of way, I think, on your order of reference, which talks about national economic security. I'm sure that careful thought was given to that, but I'd like to suggest to you, and I'm doing a bit of marketing here, that the issues that you're talking about are a national security issue, period. They're not a subunit of national security. This goes to the definition of national security, which I hope and think that you use a fairly broad one. But to my mind, it's anything which materially affects a nation's sovereignty. And the things that the committee is talking about now can potentially very much affect a nation's sovereignty. Just like money laundering conducted by a foreign state or a devastating national security issue. Anyway, that's just a small marketing effort on my part. I think that while I'm not an expert in financial systems, I hope and think I can offer you a couple of useful context points. And one is that context and the environment in which cyber attacks occur, be they against financial institutions or anywhere out, is important. These things don't occur in isolation. And I would argue that you cannot deal with cyber threats in the financial sector without an understanding of cyber threats generally, and you can't understand cyber threats without understanding threats generally directed against Canada and the West. We all live in a globalized world, and that certainly applies to national security threats. I say this for a couple of reasons. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Cold War, where it was fairly simple. Those who were causing trouble and those who were receiving trouble were basically states. I'm oversimplifying, but it was the Warsaw Pact against the East. Some companies were affected. I think one of the contextual points that is important is that our adversaries or instigators today are states, they're terrorist groups, they're criminal organizations, and I'll come back to that. They're corporations. They're civil society groups, and they're individuals. So any of these could be causing, I think, difficulties in the financial systems that you're concerned about. The targets, on the other hand, used to be basically states. I'd argue they're now states, they're corporations, they're civil society, political parties, not-for-profits, and individuals. So the world is fairly complicated. And if either the financial institutions themselves or the government is going to deal with cyber attacks against them, my suggestion to you is they have to know and understand the context in which all of that is occurring. They just can't build walls abstractly. So who or what might initiate cyber attacks against our financial sector, I think, is very relevant. And I don't try very hard to do sound bites, but I have one, which is that national security is not national. It's not national in the sense that no single state can deal with these issues, certainly not a relatively small middle power like Canada. And you need international cooperation. And secondly, I would argue that no federal state or no nation state can deal with these sorts of things without the help of provincial or regional governments and corporations and society generally. I would argue with you that it is a significant mistake for financial institutions to argue they can do it all themselves, just as it is a mistake for the government to accept that supposition or that hypothesis. I talked a little bit about context and environment, so I'd just like to lay out very, very quickly the kinds of threats that national security that Canada is facing. I think the revisionist states, Russia and China, extremism generally, including terrorists, there are issues cyber. There's the dysfunctional West and their rogue states and issues. Iran and North Korea come to mind. I'm sort of emphasizing this a little bit because I think all of these are interrelated, far more than they might have been 15 or 20 years ago, and they leverage against each other and they amplify their effects. So, for example, Russia and China use cyber systems and benefit from a dysfunctional West because we're not fighting them together. Terrorist groups benefit from the discord caused by revisionist states, and they use cyber. So all of them interact with one another, and I think we need to keep that in mind when we do that. One of the other issues that I wanted to emphasize and suggest to you is that Canada is very much threatened by cyber attacks generally and against our financial institutions. I say this because when I used to be working, one of the things that used to drive me to distraction was the view of many Canadians that Canada wasn't threatened. You know, we had 3 oceans and the United States, so it made it very difficult for governments and others to sort of deal with a lot of national security threats because the average Canadian, absent an event, didn't think that there was a great issue. I think Canada is very much threatened by a variety of the institutions and entities that I just talked about. But why is this the case? We have an advanced economy, advanced science and technology. We're part of the Five Eyes in NATO. We're next to the US. To be honest, we're not thought internationally to have the strongest defenses on the cyber side. And any institution will go to the weakest link in the chain. And sometimes we are thought to be that, although I don't think we're doing all that badly. And also, we're threatened sometimes simply because we're hit at random. So I think it's especially important for the committee to make the point that our financial sector is indeed threatened by cyber attacks, because I don't think a lot of people believe that. And I guess one of the other things I'd like to talk about is who I think are the main instigators of potential attacks. I think they are nation states and international criminal groups. What are they going to try and do? They're going to try and deny service, old-fashioned theft, and I'll come back to that, information and intelligence acquisition, intellectual property theft, and ID theft, both for the purposes of acquiring money and espionage. Let me give you a couple of examples about states that play with countries' financial system. North Korea, they finance a lot of their operations. They get a lot of their hard currency by using their cyber capabilities to access the financial systems of various and sundry countries. For example, they had a program some time ago that allowed them to steal money systematically from ATMs around the world. They also had a program which allowed them to use to claim ransomware. More generally, they were the country that was thought to have frozen the United Kingdom's National Health Service a few years ago. So my point is that you can find out about much about this as I can just by Googling them. The United States has indicted a number of people from North Korea who've tried to do this. So this is just one example of a state that actually tries to get into Western countries' financial system. Another one is Iran, and you will have seen in the newspapers over the last 5 or 10 years a couple of examples of how Iran tried to do this, in particular against the United States and banks, and there are indictments against 7 or 8 of them. Just a couple of words about Russia and China and how I think you cannot ignore them when you talk about this, this topic. I think their main objective is twofold. One is denial of service. Another is to simply reduce Western confidence in our institutions, and they do this systematically. Criminal groups, I think, are becoming much, much more prominent in this area, and it's something we really don't talk enough about, and I hope you've had an opportunity to talk to the RCMP about this. But if you look at either RCMP or Stats Canada figures, the extent to which international criminal groups are playing with our financial institutions is going through the roof over the last little while. So in summary points, cyber attacks on our financial system are a national security issue in my view. These attacks must be viewed in broad context if we're going to deal with them effectively. There's no silver bullet to any of this. It will only work, we'll only reduce the risks if governments, corporations, and civil society cooperate. I think government needs to share more information with the private sector. It's something that we do far less than the United Kingdom and the United States. And if you can't expect private corporations to be an effective partner if they're not aware of what's going on. I think the financial sectors needs to report these attacks and these breaches far more systematically than they do. These issues are evergreen, and we need to talk about them more than we do. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fadden. Mr. Ryland, 10 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Mark Ryland. I'm the Director of Security Engineering with Amazon Web Services. I work in the office of the CISO, so I work directly for our Chief Information Security Officer. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you today. I suspect you all know a bit about Amazon.com, generally speaking, but allow me to add some Canadian details. Amazon.ca has been serving our Canadian customers since 2002, and we have maintained a physical presence in the country since 2010. Amazon now employs more than 10,000 full-time employees in Canada, and in 2018 we announced an additional 6,300 jobs. We have 2 tech hubs, which are important software development centers, with multiple office sites in Vancouver and Toronto. We employ hundreds of software designers and engineers who are working on some of our most advanced projects for our global platforms. We also have offices in Victoria with abooks.com and Winnipeg with a division called ThinkBox. We also operate 7 fulfillment centers in Canada, 4 in the Greater Toronto area, 2 in the Vancouver area, 1 in Calgary. 4 more have been announced. Those will be coming online in 2019 in Edmonton and Ottawa. But why am I here? What is this cloud thing? You might be wondering why we're here discussing cybersecurity of the financial sector at all. Well, roll back the clock about 12 years ago, we launched a division of our company we call Amazon Web Services, or AWS for short. AWS started when the company realized that we had developed our core competency in operating very large-scale technology infrastructure and data centers. So with that competency, we embarked on a broader mission of taking that technological understanding and serving an entirely new customer segment, that is developers and businesses, with an information technology service that they can use to build their own very sophisticated, scalable applications. The term cloud computing refers to the on-demand delivery of IT resources over the internet or over private networks, with pay-as-you-go pricing, so you pay for only what you use. Instead of buying and owning and maintaining a lot of technology equipment, such as computers and storage and networks, databases, and so forth, you simply call an API and get access to these services on an on-demand basis. Sometimes it's called utility computing. It's similar to how consumers flip on a light switch and access electricity in their homes. And the power company sort of takes care of all the background. All this infrastructure is created, built. There is, of course, physical equipment and infrastructure behind all this, but from the user perspective, you simply call an API. You call a software interface or click a button with a mouse and get access to all this capability, and then are charged for the usage of that. It's all fully controlled by software, which means it's all automatable. That's a really important point that I'll make several times, is the ability to automate things is a big advantage in the security realm. Instead of doing things manually and using, we don't have enough experts, believe me, to do all the command typing that needs to be done, so you need to write software to automate. So as of today, we provide highly reliable, secure, and resilient services to over 1 million customers in 190 countries. Our cloud platform is actually, you can think of it as a federation of separate cloud regions. There's 20 of those around the world and 61 availability zones. Each region is made up of separate physical locations to create greater resiliency. Montreal is home to our AWS Canada region, which has 2 availability zones, and each availability zone is in 1 or more distinct geographic areas with redundancy and for power, for networking, and connectivity and so forth, designed to minimize the chance that they could both fail. So with this capability, with multiple physical locations, our customers can build highly available and very fault-tolerant applications. Even the failure of an entire data center need not result in an outage for our customer and their applications. The companies that leverage AWS range from large enterprises such as Porter Airlines, the National Bank of Canada, Montreal Exchange, TMX Group, Capital One, and BlackBerry, to lots of startups, Airbnb, Pinterest, et cetera, and companies like Netflix, many of you have heard of, all running on the AWS cloud. We also work a lot with public sector organizations around the globe, including Government of Ontario, the UK, the Ministry of Justice, a number of other, the Home Office, Singapore, Australia, US, many customers globally in the public sector area. So what are the advantages of moving to the cloud? There are three primary benefits I want to highlight. First is agility and elasticity. So with agility, allows you to quickly spin up resources and use them and shut them down when you don't need them. And this really means for the first time, customers can treat information technology in a more experimental fashion, because experiments are cheap. You can actually try things. If it doesn't work, you spend very little money. Instead of this large capital expenditure, large software licensing costs, you can do this much more dynamic model. And experimentation is very helpful when it comes to innovation. So that leads to greater innovation. In terms of elasticity, customers often had to over-provision for their systems. They'd have to buy too much capacity because only once a year or once a month there was a need for a great deal of capacity. Most of the time the systems were relatively idle. And so you had a lot of waste in this over-provisioning model. In the cloud, you can provision what you need. You can scale up, meaning add more capacity or subtract capacity dynamically as you go. Another advantage is cost savings. So part of what I just described also leads to cost savings. You're only using the amount of capacity you need at any one time. You can also treat your expenditures in terms of moving from capital expenses to operational expenses, which many people find very helpful. And in short, our customers are able to maintain very high levels of infrastructure and at a price that is very difficult to do when you buy and manage all your own infrastructure. Now, the third reason, the one that I really want to emphasize here in my testimony, is actually the benefit of security. So the AWS infrastructure puts very strong safeguards in place to protect customer security and privacy. All the data is stored in highly secure data centers. We provide full encryption very easily. We just literally check a box or call an API. All your data is encrypted. Rich access control and logging to see what's going on, to monitor and control who has access. And our global network provides built-in inherent capabilities for protecting customers from DDoS and other network-type attacks. Before the cloud, organizations had to spend a lot of time and money managing their own data centers and worrying about all the security of everything inside, and that meant not time focused specifically on their core mission. And with the cloud, organizations can function more like startups. We're moving at the speed of ideas without upfront costs and the worry of defending the full range of security threats. Previously, organizations had to adopt either this big capital investment program or enter into long-term contracts with vendors. And really, the other most difficult part was the companies and organizations were responsible for the entire stack, everything from the concrete to the blocks on the doors, all the way to the software, completely the responsibility of the customer. And with cloud, we take care of a number of those responsibilities. So what about cloud security? Organizations more and more are realizing that there's a link between IT modernization and on using the cloud and improving their security posture. Security depends on the ability to stay a step ahead of rapidly and continuously evolving threat landscape, requiring both operational agility and access to the latest technologies. As the legacy infrastructure, which many of our customers use, approach obsolescence or need replacing, organizations move to the cloud to take advantage of our advanced capabilities. Increased automation is key, as I mentioned before, and the cloud provides the highest level of automation. The possibility of automation is maximized using a cloud platform. Cloud security is our #1 priority. In fact, we say that security is job zero, even before job one. And organizations across all sectors will highlight how commercial cloud can offer improved security across their IT infrastructure. So therefore, many organizations, such as financial institutions, are modernizing their capabilities to use cloud platforms. We've been architected for organization security and for some of the most security-sensitive organizations, such as financial services. Now, there is a shared responsibility. Customers are still responsible for maintaining security of their environments, but the surface area, the amount of things they need to worry about is greatly reduced because we take care of a lot of those things, and they can focus their attention on what remains. So therefore, customers from major banks to federal governments have repeatedly told us, and we have quotes we can supply to the committee, that they feel more secure in their cloud-based deployments of their applications than they do in their on-premise physical infrastructure in their own data centers. Therefore, in sum, cloud should not be seen as a barrier to security, but actually as a technology that helps security, and therefore very helpful in the financial services realm as a part of a general solution for modernization, improving security. We also have a few policy recommendations, which we'll provide in our written testimony. One of the things is we think there's an overemphasis on physical location of data. So very often people think, I've got to have data physically here in order to protect it. But actually, if you look at the history of cyber incidents, everything's done remotely. If you're connected to a network and the network has outside access, that's where all the bad things happen. So physical location of data, especially when you can encrypt everything, so physical access to storage drives or whatever literally is not a threat vector. Really, there should be some flexibility for banks and other institutions as to where they physically place their data, and they should be able to run their workloads around the globe, reaching their global customers with low latency and storing data potentially outside of Canada. There's a couple more in here. So data residency. We believe also that centralizing security assessment makes a lot of sense instead of having every agency or every regulatory body separately evaluate cloud security. Centralize that in an organization like the CCCS, where they can do a central evaluation, determine whether clouds are meeting the requirements, and then that authority to operate can be inherited by other organizations throughout the government and under-regulated industries. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ryland. First 7 minutes goes to Mr. Spengman, please.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Fadden, it's particularly good to have you here. In your former role as National Security Advisor, I think you have a unique perspective on how this connects to the Department of National Defense and questions of national defense. And I want to start by asking you about that. Where are the intersections, where are the gray zones between what we look at as public safety and as national defense questions? These two committees have their own mandates. In a way, we're stovepiped that way. Perhaps there should be a joint study between the two of them. But can you make some general comments of how much the national defense component plays a role in good cybersecurity and how much lies on the public safety side?
Well, I tend to agree with you that drawing distinctions in this area is a little bit artificial, and that one of the things that should be avoided to the extent possible is the development of these silos. We have quite enough of them as we are, and we don't need any more. I think national defense's main contribution is through the communications security establishment, and insofar as the private sector is concerned, the Center for Cybersecurity. They tend to operate, quite cooperatively with other parts of the national security environment in Canada. I would argue, in part on the basis of what I knew when I was working, but in part because I now operate a little bit in the private sector, that they certainly were a welcome development, but they have not solved all the problems of cyber attacks here or anywhere else. I think one of the big problems they have, and this is a defense issue in the sense that the Minister of Defense is responsible, we talk about these things, we share far less, we talk about them less, we share far less with the private sector than do a variety of other countries. And I don't blame any particular government or any particular official. There's something in the Canadian DNA that we think that national security should be dealt with and not talked about. But I would argue that in many cases we're far better off if we talk about them a little bit without going in operational detail. It raises awareness. It allows both government and corporations to talk and to share more information than is otherwise the request. But I think the main contributor is CSE.
Thank you for that. I had the opportunity to ask the last panel about the distinction, if there is one, between state actors and non-state actors qualitatively in terms of their capacity to execute a threat. Can you comment on that? Does a state actor simply have more capacity, more hackers, more people, or are there other qualitative differences that really put that type of actor into a different category altogether?
I think there are state actors and state actors. I think China and Russia are at the top of the league. They spend almost unlimited resources on their cyber capabilities. They're very, very good at it. I think it's generally accepted that China uses the vacuum cleaner approach. They'll grab just about anything they can. The Russians, I think, are somewhat better technologically, and they're more surgical in what they seek to acquire. I think international criminal groups are not at that level, but they're getting to be very, very good. They're a very smart collection of people there who figured out it's easier to enrich themselves using cyber devices than using kinetic action of some form or other. Also, there are no borders, and to the extent there are no borders, it's far easier. I guess the last group I would mention is terrorist groups. They're in a different category. Some of them have a limited cyber capability. It's not really worldwide. But I guess the point I would make is, again, in particular to the state actors, make it important that we regard cyber defenses as evergreen. You know, and I'm not talking in particular about Mr. Ryland's company, but any protective measures that we put in place. If you have a really aggressive actor and you give them enough time and technology, they'll find a way around them. So my point is, we need to constantly renew our defensive measures. We need to constantly advance our technology, mostly against nation states, but increasingly against international criminal groups.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you a question about content in the digital domain, both on the civilian side and on the military side. So Facebook just came out with a decision to ban a number of entities, individuals that are not meeting their standard, including Faith Goldie, who is a white nationalist and Canadian. We've also had discussions in the Defense Committee about Russian disinformation campaigns and deliberate false content in the social realm. How much of an issue is content? Where do you see the trends going? Is there a trend towards quote-unquote banning content? And if so, what happens? Do we push that kind of content into the dark web, or are we solving some problems?
I think content is appalling, disgusting, unrealistically terrible. I mean, if you sit down some Saturday afternoon or rainy Sunday and start with a bit of imagination going through the web, you have, right-wing stuff that is as bad as the Nazis. You have jihadist literature that advocate the, systematic killing of people. They're also, and that's not talking about the dark web, which is another problem again. So I think content is a real issue. I would argue that what Facebook is trying to do is a good first step, but I really don't want Facebook to become my thought controller. On the other hand, I worry rather the same way about governments. I don't want governments to become my thought controllers by determining what happens. So I think we need a bit of a national discussion on who does this. One way that Parliament has dealt with this issue in the area of money laundering. You may recall there was a debate years and years ago about how to deal with money laundering. We were just going to make it a crime. But what Parliament basically did is they imposed an obligation on banks to know their clients. And that has significantly improved the capability of everybody to deal with money laundering. Hasn't eliminated it, but it's helped it. I think there's something to be said for government setting up a framework, either statutory or regulatory, that requires companies that play in this broad area to know whom they're allowing to access the web, and then direct them as to what they can and can't do. But because in my old age I've become a bit wary about being told what to think, I think that, also after 40 years in government, but I think whether it's government or the private sector, there needs to be a measure of transparency so that we know both what is being done and what is not being done. But none of this is going to work, I think, if the average Canadian isn't more aware of what's available, and that average Canadian has some means of registering his or her displeasure. Because right now, yes, you can call the Mounties, but they have so much to worry about, it's pretty low on their priorities.
Thanks very much. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spengler. Mr. Palus, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Bonjour, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good day, gentlemen. Mr. Fadden, in 2010, you gave an interview to CBC, which was reported in the Globe and Mail, in which you mentioned there'd been interference by other states on public servants, on provincial ministers, and in Canadian political circles. People in the NDP and the Liberals asked for your resignation, and luckily you stayed in your position. This morning we found out that the report that just came out from the Parliamentary Committee on National Security confirms what you said, and clearly confirms that China is a dangerous player in the security of Canada. Given what you said earlier, you explained some problems. I'd like to hear the solutions when you talk about dysfunction in the West. Could you elucidate and clarify what we could do and what that means exactly?
I talk about the dysfunctional West. I mean that I mean, I'm sure you don't want to get into a large discussion about the current U.S. administration, but they are a significant issue right now in the sense that the views of the current U.S. president are promoting massive instability. People are uncertain as to what's going on. The United Kingdom hasn't taken a major decision in a year and a half. Monsieur Macron is concerned about what's going on with the Veston jaune. Germany's preoccupied with replacing Mrs. Merkel, and God knows what the Italians are doing. So my point is that while we're worrying about these major issues, we're giving an opportunity for Russia and China in particular to poke and prod in a way that they could not do if we were a little bit more together. I'm not suggesting the world's coming to an end. I really am not. But I think that our adversaries, and I call them adversaries, not enemies, are very active. They take advantage of every opportunity. So I think we need to start rebuilding those close ties that we've had amongst some countries since World War II. And I also think we need to realize more than we do, and it's one of the pathways that I think we need to talk about, is to appreciate, Russia and China are in their own way great countries. They've made great contributions to civilization, but right now they are fundamentally unhappy with their position on this planet, and they're trying to change it using virtually any method. I don't think we think about this very much. And if we don't think about it and try and do something about it, we're really behind the 8 ball. So I think the first thing is to develop a greater understanding of what's happening. Somebody asked me the other day in the media why Russia went to Syria. There's no prospect of territorial acquisition. There's no prospect, except they were trying to cause trouble, and they effectively succeeded. They've delayed the elimination of the caliphate, and they're doing this in a whole raft of areas. They played with the elections in the United States, Germany, France, and I believe Italy, and all they're trying to do is not really shift who's going to win, but they're trying to diminish public confidence in public institutions. So all of this, I think, needs to be talked about more. We need to get a grip amongst particularly core Western countries about how serious the problem is. Parts of the U.S. administration considers this more important than we do sometimes. The Brits are at another level. We need a consensus in the West that we have a problem. The U.S. has just shifted their national security priorities to great power conflict after being on terrorism for the last many years. Well, if that's the case, we need to think about what we're going to do about Russia and China without going to war, which is not what I'm advocating. So talking about it, understanding the nature of the threat, and developing closer ties internationally, because I do firmly believe national security is not national, not in the way it's run today. We need to work with everybody.
Merci. Si on revient à notre sujet de base, qui est
Thank you. If we get back to our basic subject, banking and finances, we've met many stakeholders in various banks. We see the banks, the government structure, and the political. When we talk about security issues, potential enemies, the politicians are always hesitant. The banks have measures on their side, but the people we don't see right now, the people in the shadows, do you think that they're effective enough to compensate for politics? Both sides. I'm not referring to one side or another, but do you think we are effective? Or should there be strong action taken on this front?
I should admit up front that I'm probably prejudiced, having spent a goodly number of years working in this area, but I think there's been a lot of progress over the last little while. And there's much more cooperation and collaboration. But I would argue two things. One, the world is becoming much more complex, and I think it could be argued that we need more resourcing. When I used to work for the government, the last thing you wanted to do was embarrass your minister by saying I wanted more money, and I'm not really saying that now. But if you take, from the Cold War to terrorism to the cyber issues that we have to great power conflict, yes, all of these institutions have had more resources, but it may not be enough today. So I ask that. I guess the other issue I would say, I was told over the years by several politicians from both sides that there aren't very many votes in national security, and that's one of the reasons why governments are sometimes hesitant to take some of the steps that you've implied. However much politicians may get frustrated with officials, they do take the lead from the political side of things. And I think we need to be a little bit more proactive sometimes than we are, because technology is moving, the threat is moving, and we seem to be playing catch up. And I don't direct this at any government or any official. It's just, it seems to be the way we do it. Largely because, you know, if you're the Minister of Finance or the President of the Treasury Board, the last thing you want to do every 2 years to say, well, here's another $250 million. I'm just picking a number. But, you know, the technological changes, some of which Mr. Ryland talked about, and there are a whole raft of others, it's very hard for government to keep up with these things without a constant, ongoing effort. And at the same time, you're worrying about Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. You're worried about international criminal groups. I think we're beginning to underestimate the problem with terrorists just because we've whacked a few of them. So, long answer to a short question. I think generally speaking, people are doing as well as they can, but it's very difficult to galvanize everybody who works on this, political officials and the private sector, unless there's some consensus on how serious the threat is. I would say with great respect, there's no such consensus in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Paulus. Mr. Dubé, 7 minutes, please.
Oui, merci. Pardon, merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Island, my first question is for you. With regard to your services, I don't know whether you're in a position to explain the separation of responsibilities between you and your clients. That is, what is the role of your clients to ensure the safety of data that they stock on their servers using your service?
A nuanced conversation, but I'd say just to give a kind of summary, if you look at something like in the United States, there's a security control framework based on a NIST standard called FedRAMP, which lists something like 250 controls, in other words, security properties that you want in a system. And if you take that whole security framework, our platform covers more than 1/3 of those controls. They're simply things that we literally take care of on behalf of our customers. They don't have to worry about at all. About 1/3 roughly are shared where we take care of some of the things, but the customer has to do certain configurations and make certain choices that are correct for their requirements. And they're optional because it's reasonable to do sort of either one, but depending on what their needs are, they have to choose. And then roughly 1/3 that are pretty much all the responsibility of the customer. So what we've done is we've just decreased the scope of concern for the customer, and we delineate pretty clearly, and we have literally control documents that say, you know, who's responsible for what. And through that method, we have a lot of material, white papers, best practices documents. We have what we call a well-architected framework to help people do that remaining responsibility. We want them to be very successful at that. So we put a lot of effort into helping them design secure systems. But when you get to that level, it all depends on the needs of the application. So there's not a correct answer to some question. It's going to be, it depends, right? So it depends on the application, depends on the requirements. So, but in general, that's, I think, a good summary of the kind of model that we work with our customers, is to take care of a number of things that they normally would worry about, describe some areas where we do some things, they need to do others, and then help them be successful in the remaining parts of building a secure system with lots of tools and features that make it easy to do the remainder.
Merci. Donc, juste pour bien comprendre, est-ce que...
Thank you. Now, to understand this correctly, you said that about 1/3 is exclusively the client's or customer's responsibility. They have to configure all this. Does that create a barrier for businesses that can have access to your services? Does the expertise already have to exist in that customer's company or that government organization? The example that comes to mind is Shared Services Canada. I think it has a contract with you. But given what we see in the news recently, their track record is quite bad when it comes to implementing software systems. So can there be deficiencies that exist or lack of expertise in a company or a government agency that could limit its capacity, a customer's capacity to deal with you or any comparable company?
Only possible in using any technology to not use it properly. And so we see a big part of our mission is education and training of our customers. And we do a lot of that. And a lot of it's actually free as part of a process of helping them to understand this kind of new paradigm of cloud computing. That said, there's a lot of commonality with things they've already been doing for a long time. For example, if you're running, I'll just make up a web. Let's say you're running a citizen-facing web application for a government. You already have some kind of understanding of how to secure a web system. You have an authentication system, password reset, those kinds of properties that are built into the system. And if you use that similar kind of system on a cloud platform, a lot of that's the security properties of that would be similar as the one that you've been doing historically. So it's not a completely new world. It's not a 100% new skill set that is required for security professionals, but there are definitely differences and changes, and so it's part of the progress of the industry. Just like, we 20 or 30 years ago, we spent a lot of time on mainframe security. Now that's not something people focus. There's still mainframe systems running, and they still must need to be secure, but the focus tends to be on the new things, the new systems, new applications. And I think the transition to cloud computing has a similar property of any type of modernization and use of new technology, that there's definitely some learning curve, but you can also get a lot more done with less labor, with less actual human beings. And this is an area where sometimes when automation comes up, it's considered controversial because, what if we remove, people will be taking away jobs from workers? Well, in the cybersecurity area, everyone recognizes we have a huge labor shortage of skilled laborers in this area. And so any type of technology that increases automation enables a skilled worker to come up with a solution and then replicate that broadly is a big win. So everyone can get behind greater automation and in the security realm. So I think that's one of the main reasons why people find the cloud platforms to be advantageous. Yes, there's a learning curve, but the ability to automate things is really quite dramatically better than using traditional technology.
J'ai deux dernières questions rapidement. La première, c'est
I have two more questions quickly. Maybe you're not the best placed in your organization to answer this, but let's say there was a data leak, a breach, and there's shared responsibility. Who is legally responsible ultimately, especially in the financial sector? If a client loses money, is it the bank's fault? Is it the fault of the company that allows for storage of data in the cloud? How do you see this exactly?
The shared responsibility also is the line between who takes that responsibility. If there was a problem in one of our systems, we would be responsible for that. If a customer misconfigures or misuses one of our systems, then they are responsible for that. Now, again, we do a lot to support customers, and we have many, many cases in the team I work in, the security team, where customers have an issue and some kind of incident, and they ask for our help. And although technically we're not at fault at all, we still are very aggressive in responding to help them get out of the problems that they've caused. I'll take a kind of simple, non-controversial example of we have systems where customers have accidentally deleted data without having proper backups, and come to us in a panic. And at one level, we could say, well, the system was working just the way it was described. You made a mistake. There's nothing we can do. But we will go to great lengths to help them try to figure out solutions to those kinds of problems. And similarly with security incidents. So,
Thank you, Mr. Dubé.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Mr. Graham, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'd love to continue on that line, but I'll come back to that in a second. Mr. Fadden, I don't think anybody will disagree with your assessment that our study is really about national security as opposed to financial as the pigeonhole. And I would say that there are a lot of votes on national security, but only after an incident has happened. Yeah. So, yeah. You said national security is not national; it's transnational. It's supranational. And so, what I'm wondering is, does Canada have a network backbone strong enough to handle Canadian needs? And do we have enough intercontinental connections to handle Canadian needs? And does it matter?
I think it matters a great deal. Do we have the backbone or the intercontinental connections? I find it difficult to answer that question because I think it's an answer that requires two parts, one dealing with governments generally and one dealing with the non-governmental sector. I think insofar as government's concerned, we have very, very close alliances with the Five Eyes, the United States in particular, and there's an immense sharing of information. And I would argue it's pretty effective, notwithstanding the dysfunction that I was talking about. When I was still working, the approach taken to deal with some of these issues, it's a bit like talking about cancer. That's not particularly helpful. I notice some of you have your cancer. Talking about cancer generally is not particularly helpful because the cure for cancers goes to the 130 odd kinds of cancer. So I find that talking about cyber generally is not often very helpful. You have to sort of break it down into its component parts. So we used to divide up the Canadian economy into strategic sectors, telecoms, financial, nuclear. There were 11 or 12 of them. And I think the connections they have with their home offices, with each other in Canada and abroad, vary, quite honestly. I think, for example, our nuclear sector is pretty well organized, and I think the general view as sectors go, financial sector is not doing badly. Some of the others, less so. So I'm not trying to avoid answering your question, but I think it's difficult to sort of just give you a yay or a nay. And there's no one entity, government or non-governmental, that's responsible, I don't think. It's just as things have evolved.
I'll come to Mr. Rather a bit more. We talked about the over-provisioning model advantages of cloud. You're talking about the vast resources and being able to balance them across systems, which we couldn't have before. Just as an example, what's the computing power of a key fob today versus that of the Apollo?
There's more power in the key fob, probably 32-bit microcontroller.
When we have that kind of massive change in computing capacity, what's the security impacts of that change? And is the technology changing faster than we're able to keep up with it?
No, I don't think so. Technology changes rapidly, but there are people driving those technological changes. So in general, there's experts that build the systems and understand how they work and how to secure them. Now, there may be a lag time in terms of broad understanding of those cutting edge technologies, but often those experts are also designing things to make them more secure by default. I think IoT is a great example. We don't have time to go into the details, but we've all recognized the problems in the past with Internet of Things, home devices, et cetera, being deployed in very insecure fashion. And historically, it was the cheapest and easiest thing to do. But if you look at the newer technology that we provide or that Microsoft or other large-scale providers give you, by default, their systems are far more secure. They're updatable in place, which they didn't used to be. They use secure protocols by default. They didn't used to do that. You can go right down the list of how the business interests of these large providers align with building systems that are secure by default, where previously that was left to the person who was building the smart refrigerator or the smart toaster or whatever. So technological shifts can actually raise the bar across the whole industries by investment and by alignment of business interests with higher security.
To go back to your clouds, do public or does the public or even the organizations you deal with truly understand what a cloud is or what the cloud is?
There's often a lot of confusion for, number one, just this idea, well, what is it out there? There must be something. But also there's the confusion between consumer use cases like Facebook and Google. People think, well, that's like a cloud. And then but when you provision IT services from a cloud computing vendor, then a completely different model. First of all, we don't monetize your data. We lock it down. We never look at it. We have a totally different way of thinking about it. The one thing they have in common is network accessibility, typically, right? Be able to reach them from anywhere. But yes, there's a lot of confusion, and often when we start off with our presentations, we'll put up a world map and we actually have little dots on the map, like there is where our stuff is in that city or that region. And so people know that there's physical equipment behind all this capability.
On your servers, your AWS, is that principally virtual servers, or is that another system besides that, so virtual machines?
That's one of our core services. It's called EC2, but we have literally 100 other services, and the trend is really away from using virtual machine services because that's where the customer has to take the most responsibility. People would prefer the higher level services where we take increased responsibility and they just have to do very minimal configuration.
But if you're not on a virtual machine, you're using the services provided, how much control can the client actually have? And there's a balance to be had, right? So as a client, could I choose what operating system to put on my virtual machine? I could put a Debian system on there, whatever it is you want, but what could you put on a non-virtual machine? What are the other options?
Well, again, it depends on the use case, but for a storage service, you don't care what the compute model is. You're just storing data. Databases are kind of in the middle. There's a range of choices and options, but people do tend to prefer. Over time, you'll see more and more use of what are called abstract services. I just upload my JavaScript function to this function as a service, and the code executes whenever certain events fire. And I really have no concept of the operating system or anything else. It's just done for me. It's handled for me.
I only have about 40 seconds left, so my last question for both of you is security advantages, disadvantages of open versus closed software, open versus closed source software.
There's something called the many eyes hypothesis for open source software, that the fact that people can see the code makes it more likely that security and other flaws will be discovered. I'm not sure there's a really strong empirical backing for that, because there's lots of security flaws that have existed in open code, but there is the big advantage that there's people have more kind of control over their own destiny, because you can do your own investigation, you can make your fixes, you're not dependent on a vendor to discover and fix security problems. So I'd say on the whole, there's some real advantages to open source, but it's not completely black and white.
Thank you, Mr. Graham.
Chairman, would you allow me to make two quick statements? Mr. Ryland has been talking about what he does and what his clients do, but if we just imagine a bank for a minute, I think it's important that we not become mesmerized by the really effective things that Mr. Ryland does. So if I took a device that I could probably get if I tried hard and stuck it under the desk of the executive vice president of the Bank of Montreal, it would be a recording device, and as he accessed the information and put all his passwords in, I would be able to access these from, the office next door or another city. Talking about the Internet of Things, I still don't think we've come to grips yet with, developing a relationship with a light bulb. And I think things are better than they used to be. But again, if you control the light bulb, and I'm making a joke of it, but whatever device you want to use, it has the capacity for acquiring information. And the security of the systems that we're talking about have two real components, the part that Mr. Ryland talked about and the environment that the financial institutions use. They're equally important, because if you get in from the financial institution's perspective effectively, because either through a device that I've talked about or some other device, you can not only wreak havoc in that financial institution, but complicate Mr. Ryland's life a great deal. So it's not just the highly complex security devices that Mr. Ryland talks about, it's a whole raft of other things as well. And I would argue that, the Royal Bank of Canada probably does these very well. The Lower Mandible Manitoba Credit Union, forgive anybody here from Manitoba, may not, but it's the weakest link in the chain issue that we haven't really come to grips with as effectively as we could.
Okay, thank you. Well, with this study, I've been paranoid of talking in front of my refrigerator or my thermostat. Now I have to worry about my key fob and light bulbs. Mr. Motz, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Mr. Fadden, when we were talking about combating terrorism previously, you have referred to our current Canadian model as more like a whack-a-mole, where suppress a problem after it has begun. Now, is there a mechanism to be more proactive or prevent attacks with respect to cybersecurity, more than just education or literacy?
Yes, I think there is. If you look at what you can do, and I'm not an engineer, so I've sort of reduced this to language that I can understand. You can have purely defensive measures. You build something in whatever system you have you have firewalls and whatever. You have what I call aggressive defensive. You have the capacity to know when somebody's trying to go out and come in, and you deal with that. And then you have the purely offensive. You have the capacity to go out and either seek trouble or to degrade somebody else's capabilities. I think we're really fairly good on the first. We're not so bad on the middle. I don't think we're so great on the third. And I'm not sure that we, Canada, have to do this alone. We can do this with a bunch of other countries. But the capacity of, I will call them cyber adversaries, to use 37 cutouts, makes it very difficult for people to know where they're coming from and whatnot. So you really do need some sort of worldwide monitoring system. I don't think we have that. I think the United States, insofar as I understand, tries, but there's a limit to what even they can do. So you probably have heard of former U.S. Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. He was sort of ridiculed at one point, but I think he said one thing that's true, and it applies to this area. You don't know what you don't know. And I think Mr. Ryland will agree with me.
There's the unknowns, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
And those are the ones that I'm worried about. And technology is moving so fast that we find it very, very difficult to stay ahead. So long answer to short question, but I don't think we're doing as well as we might do internationally.
Okay, so to take that further, you have recently suggested that we're kind of on the margins when it comes to the ability to monitor returned or returning ISIS terrorists or foreign fighters back to our soil. Would you say that we are in a better position when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I think if you're dealing with the government of Canada, probably yes, because I think the government over the course of the last two couple of governments, they've made some real strides in developing the capability to defend government of Canada systems, and they've limited the government of Canada systems access to the internet, which make things a lot easier to control. But I kept coming back, and I keep coming back now to the weakest link in the chain. All you need is one weak link that allows you to access everything. So having said that, I think on the cyber side, the government is doing better than they might do on terrorism. I don't think they're doing terribly on terrorism. I was just trying to suggest that there's a limit somewhere to what you can do. If you expand that to provincial governments, for example, there are connections between the provinces and the federal government. The provinces vary a great deal, I believe, in how protected they are. And then you keep moving on, and it doesn't take a great deal of imagination. Just to give you an example, I read a couple of years ago, there was a mom and pop metal welding shop, and I think it was Arizona. They had their own little server and whatnot. And a foreign state used a problem there in order to access an element of the U.S. government in China. So the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't take a big hole to use a physical manifestation to get in. And I think, generally speaking, we're not doing badly. We really aren't. But if we think that we have blocked every possibility of a cyber attack against us or our economy, then I think we're being way too optimistic.
So we have silos in law enforcement and fighting some battles sometimes and sharing of information. And you already alluded to the fact that in Canada we have a lack of resources that are really applied to this issue. So do you see the same issue of siloing when it comes to cybersecurity as well?
Not so much siloing. Some of my former colleagues will want to kick me under the table for saying this, but I don't think there's a central controlling brain to deal with cyber issues in the government of Canada. I think CSE has a real role. I think public safety has a role. The military sort of look at things slightly differently. GAC has a role in terms of dealing with things internationally. And the ISED, I think that's what it's called, ISED, is involved in the regulation of the internet and how we play with them. I don't think the American practice of creating a czar is necessarily the issue, but I would suggest, at least on the basis of when I was NSA, that we could have used more coordination and maybe at some point some more direction. It's a very complex field, and departments worry first about themselves. So, I mean, machinery is the Prime Minister's prerogative. He or she will organize things as he or she wants, but this is one area that I think is so global in its manifestations, so complex. Simply saying to various departments and agencies, you have to cooperate, may not be enough.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Motz. And final 5 minutes, Mr. Picard.
Thank you. Mr. Ryland, my understanding of the cloud is a centralized structure where security measures and safety level are so high, clients use which data you store, feel pretty sure that they are safe against outsider attack at 99%.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair summary. They certainly feel that they have a leg up in building proper defenses because we're taking care of a lot of things they would otherwise have to worry about.
But you just said to Mr. Graham that you had no knowledge about the content stored on your server because it's not your business to know what your client put on your server. So how safe is your system from Trojan horse?
Very safe because we constantly build and test our systems to assume that we have hostile customers. We assume we're being attacked by our customers and take that into account and make sure that the isolation properties of the system are very, very strong.
So the safety level goes both sides, from outside attacks as well as inside.
Yes.
Action. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Fadden, this study brought us in a journey where we had no clue we were going, because it's so vast and so big and so wide and so diversified. But we totally understand the relevancy of any action to be taken on this, especially on my side with the financial institutions. From your knowledge from the government and now your actual experience, what kind of policy, where should we start in terms of establishing policies, and some of your recommendation you may have?
Well, I think, Chairman, I would go back to one of the points I made earlier. I think the government legislatively, or Parliament legislatively, has to impose obligations on financial institutions, much in the same way as they've done with money laundering. They have to require them to do a variety of things, whereas now most of the things are done in the self-interest of the financial institutions. They tend to be pretty good, but we should up, I think, significantly our reporting of breaches and attempted breaches. There's a regulation, if I remember correctly, that requires that now. It's not as fulsome as it might be. The Americans and the Brits in particular have severe penalties for institutions not reporting breaches. I don't know how we can expect to deal effectively with breaches if we don't know when they're occurring. Again, I think it's better than it has been, but still. So imposing clear obligations on the institutions, reporting of breaches, and again, some of my former colleagues are going to kick me under the table, but I don't think we share enough classified information with the private sector. I think we've done far better than we have been, 15, 20 years ago. But if you take the most senior technological official in the Royal Bank, which happens to be where I bank, but I'm not trying to promote it, and you ask them to collaborate on cyber issues, and the Canadian official isn't authorized to share any classified information. I don't see how you can have a real dialogue. The States, the UK, they clear from a classified information perspective people in the private sector. I don't mean to suggest we don't do any of this, because we do. I just argue we don't do enough of it. I would say those three things.
When you mentioned that we might be tempted to ignore, forget about Russia and China because we were focusing somewhere else, I was surprised. I thought that we were focusing so much on Russia and China that we were forgetting about real threats coming from other countries, kind of satellite countries working for those main states. And when we look at Cambridge Analytica in another committee, it was obvious that it was not Russia, maybe at the end of the day, but so many satellite offices in other countries are in action. Where should we put our focus?
That is, I think, Mr. Chairman, the $57,000 question. And I mean, the part of the problem is you can't ignore Russia and China. We can't ignore those things that you've just listed. I think we ignore international terrorist groups at our own cost. We have a whole bunch of civil society groups that muck around with cyber, and I could probably go on. The truth is we can't ignore any of them, and that's why I think that more collaboration, more sharing, and trying to get to a point that one of your other members suggested, we need to try and get ahead of the problem more than we have in the past. So I don't have an answer except to say you may well be right this 6-month period, and the next 6-month period things are going to shift. And we need to be fleet of foot. And again, after working for government for 40 years, I can say that's not one of the strong suits of ours. And it's true of governments generally, but I think we need to be fleeter than we have been to deal with all of the topics you're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Ricard. And before I suspend, I just want to thank witnesses. Usually fleet and government don't go in the same sentence. So, with that, we're going to suspend for a minute or two and re-empanel. Again, thank you for your presentation.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, that was interesting.
around the vote call at 5:30. So we'll probably stop around 5:20 as opposed to 5:30. I'll stretch it as far as I can, but that's good. So with that, we're back on, and we'll ask Mr. Drennan for his presentation. It's 10 minutes if you kind of look up, and I'll give you an idea of when you're getting close to the 10-minute mark. Please. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Drennan, for appearing.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. So I am Steve Drennan, and I'm pleased to be here today representing myself and ADGA in the cybersecurity domain and financial sector in Canada. Thank you for the invitation to provide a testimony to the Public Safety Committee at the House of Commons today and for all of your time. So a bit of background on ADGA. It's a 100% Canadian company which delivers strategic consulting, professional services, and world-class technology in defense, security, and enterprise computing, and has done that for over 50 years, providing high-end solutions engineering and staffing in the government and commercial spaces. ADGA has a lot of insight, given all of this, and expertise into domains such as cybersecurity. ADGA also has strong views, as do I, on coast-to-coast security requirements and evolution, and being abreast of the landscape and the strategic partners. And ADGA has strong converged security capability with lots of cyber assessment, design, and compliance background, just to give you a feel of where I'm coming at from today. So on review of previous testimonies online, I saw a theme that the committee already had a lot of feedback on cyber attacks, challenges, ranges, and faults in the domain. Given all of that, I thought I'd focus what I could talk about today in my time on cyber security solutions. There isn't a silver bullet to it, but there is a lot of capability that can be deployed on scale, and then there's a lot of other parts that can be developed to really increase what we do and strengthen the Canadian financial sector. And I'd like to think of it as critical infrastructure. We probably think maybe of power and dams and classified systems as critical infrastructure, but the financial sector certainly is critical infrastructure. And it's one large interdependent system, and it ranges across lots of different entities. So Bank of Canada, Payment Canada, Interac, who I know was presenting, Receiver General, merchants, small and large commercials and commercial entities, and also the consumers. So that's a lot of endpoints. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there. And it's all the data, too, in transit and in storage. So if you've been hearing and thinking about one network or one piece or one solution, it's not the whole story. There's a shift occurring in cyber. So it's shifting to socio-political attacks, brand manipulation, along with small and large volume financial attacks. And given what's at stake and the ability for cyber criminals to hide and obfuscate and launch attacks on a non-stop basis, Canada needs to have an updated approach to cyber defense in the financial sector. So the days of hiding behind walls, actual walls or firewalls, those are past. It's a very interconnected space out there. And it's important to understand the adversary too, and I think you've been briefed on that well, but cyber criminals and nation states have massive sets of resources. They'd be a very large country by GDP if all the cyber criminals put their wealth together. And they are often physically unreachable because of where they come from as well. So one stat, and I won't get into too many, but from a recent Mandiant report, Mandiant's the cyber arm of FireEye, one of our strategic partners. Brief example is a global median dwell time is 101 days. And dwell means the time that malware lives in a network until it's found and stopped. Just think about that for a second. That's an incredible amount of time for something to be sitting there exfiltrating data and taking data before it's even found. Sometimes it goes up to 2,000 days before it's found. So while the cyber problem is complex, it can be tackled in a way that is simplified for users, merchants, businesses, and banking organizations. And that's what I want to focus on today, is some of the ways we can address this. So I'll focus on cyber solution themes that can address large-scale cyber threats to Canadian financial sector. So theme one that I'd like to go over is what I call convergence of cyber data and protection capability. So think of this as next generation solutions that can be deployed on scale for everyone to use and take advantage of. And the concept being perhaps one organization could actually lead this effort and put this capability in a central location so that it would be turned on for all of the entities I was just speaking about, everything we've been thinking about. So one good example could be there's really fantastic new technology. One of them is you could link ideas around centralized artificial intelligence, machine learning, even advanced analytics, threat hunting, if you haven't heard about that. You can ask me questions about it later, and security orchestration, and you can actually create semi-automatic cybersecurity detection and response. It can be fairly automated. Sometimes you do want somebody to be able to make decisions on key points and reactions when you sense a cyber threat, especially if you're shutting down a part of a network. Smart buildings and networks can also be a part of this. So it's not just green. Green is good. But it's also when you introduce all kinds of Internet of Things sensors, and you're actually introducing a whole bunch more data, and that data then can be compromised. But if we have an ability to sense across the physical data, operational data, sometimes called OT data, and that IoT data, we can actually have solutions that can better sense when there's a problem. So for instance, if there's an environmental problem or an attack against a building or data center, you'd probably want to know about that in the cyber world and be able to respond to it. Today, it's not very merged, but it can be. There's the notion of moving forward on a cyber active defense or even offense, and that is linked to legislation and what the rules are. So when you know you're being probed and attacked, the ability to respond to it, determine where it is, shut it down, at least protect yourself is a very important capability. Securing domain name service, which is at the heart of the internet. There's actually standards around it called DNSSEC and others. That's really important because if you can't trust your address resolution and where you're going to for data, that's really important. Cyber threat intelligence that we touched on earlier. Cyber threat intelligence is really interesting because it can be done for a vertical. So you could actually have just Canadian data and just banking information. And so you would see trends of attacks in the Canadian market space. And you'd be seeing them before they're actually hitting most of your endpoints. And then you'd be able to react to it in advance. You'd be able to make decisions and do updates before it became a widespread attack. So if that could be zero-day attacks, APT attacks. But the ability to see and respond before it becomes a problem is very important.
Excuse me, Mr. Drennan.
Yeah.
The antiquated system that we have around here is just intruding into a very impressive presentation on cybersecurity. I'm told we have 50. It's not 15 minutes?
Don't use ProView. You can use.
Okay. No. Initially, I thought it was a quorum call, and so I didn't say anything. But then over here the dates or the time was running.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so it's not. So we're going to leave it as a quorum call.
Just you can save yourself 45 seconds by looking at ourcommons.ca instead of at PowerView. You get a direct feed that way.
I'm having what he looks at.
He's looking at the wrong thing. Get faster.
I'm looking at both.
I'm getting it to.
Take notes. It's talking.
Okay.
Okay, we just blew 45 seconds. I apologize for that. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Drennan, for your patience and understanding. So go ahead.
Thank you. So the last point about capability, something that could be introduced in scale, as we were talking about in this theme, could be supply chain and lifecycle management. CSE, Communication Security Establishment, that also has the Cyber Center, used to run a program called Evaluated Product List. When we talk about Huawei and people have issues and we talk about it, we have to think about everything that gets introduced, all the software that's built. It's often virtualized, put in the cloud. The hardware, the chips, where do the chips get manufactured? Where do they come from? You can actually have a complete cradle-to-grave program so that you evaluate that equipment, that software, so that you know you can trust it. And the government's the right entity to be able to manage that program. The second theme I'd like to go over is leveraging secure public cloud. And I think the speaker before me was AWS, so I'm sure you heard plenty on it. I'm here to say too that it's actually a good idea. So when you're trying to bring all these different groups together, one of the best ways to do that is with a Canadian secure public cloud. And I think we need to start thinking more about that. And I know a number of banking entities that are looking at moving that way. When you have networks inside, that's private cloud or hybrid cloud as you move out to public cloud. But actually leveraging secure public cloud on scale is really important, because that's a great way for the whole community and all those consumers to speak to each other. And if you set up the right security and policies and filters, everybody has the same security. And there are operators that have true failover within Canada. So if you have a failure, which you have to expect and count on, then when you have disaster recovery, it stays within Canada. And that's really important for the residency and custodianship of the data itself. Cyber agility is a piece that's really important here that lets you move and launch new applications. Yes?
1 minute.
1 minute?
Yeah.
All right. I'll move faster. The third theme would be about establishing a lot more trust around critical data. So the banking and key banking groups could actually become the trusted single source for registration, for authentication, for credentials. And my fourth theme was about user awareness. So let's not lose sight that we still have our weakest link as the user. We could have more specific mandates and more training so that people are more aware of what to click on, what's good behavior, what's good hygiene. In conclusion, there are next generation cyber solutions on scale that can be used to stabilize and empower the financial community. But it's going to take the right funding and drive to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Drennan. Colleagues, we have about half an hour. If I go at 7 minutes, that will be pretty well use up the half hour. So if I dropped it to 6 minutes, I could get one more question in. One more, is that fine? 6 with that? Okay, so we'll have a 6-minute round. Ms. DeBruzen, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. I actually wanted to start with your fourth theme, because that's something that has really caught my attention since the beginning of our hearings, when someone talked about having a really secure system delivering information between two cardboard boxes, and the individuals at either end being the cardboard boxes. When you're talking about user awareness, I know that you didn't get a chance to finish up what you were going to say about that, but if you could talk more about that, and what are the specific things that we can do better as a government and as public awareness, and how to increase cybersecurity, cyber hygiene, whatever we call it.
Good, and I'm glad I get to talk more about it. So yes, I don't think there are a lot of standards. So when I look at the Treasury Board guidelines and MITs and the requirements, it's not very clear. It doesn't really define what you have to do to train users and to provide a lot of cyber guidance. And it's a bit passive. So we have our cyber safe websites. We have places people can go to learn, but are we actively promoting enough information? We could have more campaigns. We could have more learning through games and monthly meetings and monthly themes to be good at, for instance, to raise an awareness. And I'll take one example on spear phishing. Has that been well covered here?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Has phishing been covered?
Yes.
Okay. So spear phishing is more accurate phishing. So if it looked like the Honorable John McKay was sending a message to all of you and he told you it was urgent, you had to click on it, you might think about clicking on it because it looks like it's coming from John McKay. No?
Yeah, sorry. Bad example.
Well, it was one example. Yeah. So if it looks like it's coming from a position of authority, sometimes and it looks like it's your style of writing, it mentions things that are common messages that you exchange messages on, it looks more likely that you should just click on it. They can use pressure. You will see sometimes formatting problems, misspelled words, but you have to look. And how often do we just pull out our devices and work really quickly to click through the messages? So a little bit of training, though, and awareness around spear phishing can help. And you can't just do it once. You actually have to do it several times. And one of the ways to do that is you do an anonymous type analysis spear phishing campaign, and you actually have almost everyone in the organization, you send them a spear phishing type email that you're the ethical person, so it's okay. and there's a link, and if they click on it, all it does is register anonymously that someone clicked on it. So at the end, you end up with a statistic of how many people clicked on it, and it's not going to be good the first time. But then you say, by the way, we ran a spearfishing campaign. Come visit Lunch and Learn, and we'll explain why you shouldn't have clicked on it, and so many people did. And the next time you do that, because you do it a second time and a third time, the awareness gets raised. And so you start raising this awareness with your users, and then your users are much better. They're never going to be 100%, but getting the percentage a lot lower is much better.
And that's helpful. That's something that an organization can do. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, from when we're looking at what recommendations we make, how can we build out on that as to what our role is. And one thing that I noted, even one of the issues that came up with one of the witnesses, was passwords. We already have a thing. When you enter a password now, it tells you you need a certain number of characters and capitals, whatever, different figures. What it doesn't ever prompt you is, have you ever used this password before? Which is apparently a big weakness, is people using the same password over and over again. And that's fairly usual. It seems like a simple, just having a pop-up box to say, hey, have you used this before? Because that means it's not a strong password, even if it meets the other markers. Are there things like that when you're looking at the financial industry, with people signing up for online banking and this type of thing, that we can try and put out as recommended standards?
Yes, and so I think there's 2 points in here. There's the cyber awareness training, and I think the microphones, you can hear it better now, and the passwords. So we'll talk about both. So for the passwords, yes, there should be more standards. They're actually easily set by policies, and it can be, you should set more policies on it, and that can be mandated in legislation. It can be more clear. So when I look at MITs or I look at requirements, it's not always clear what the password guidelines are. It's not prescriptive enough. So absolutely, that's just one example. You probably want to do away with common and known passwords that people choose often. You want to try and make sure they don't choose dates that are reflective of their own personal history that an attacker might also already have. There are ways of making sure that that gets legislated and then enforced. So that's a very good example.
Just jump in quickly on that, because
Yes.
I won't have much time. Do any countries have that? Like, are there any examples that we could look to for that type of thing?
Not that I'm aware of, but Germany and Europe tend to have a lot more legislation around this. So with GDPR and other standards, you might see it there. But I'm not 100%
I just
sure.
wanted to get that.
Yes. I would say the other thing is, though, there are too many passwords. So too many different passwords for different. So how many systems does everyone have in this room that they log into just at work? You can actually have a lot of those passwords synchronized, and then make it two-factor or biometrics on top of that to create a stronger password, but a more consistent password. And that's actually a lot more effective. And when you back it up with the ability to audit your users and look for behavior issues that you might see on the network, it's a much stronger approach than everybody here having 15 passwords that they have to recycle all the time.
Thank you, Ms. DeBruz and Monsieur Palus. No, Mr. Motts, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Brennan, for being here. As you indicated that your group works with government and industry and law enforcement on issues of security, including national security. Last year, one expert in our security study noted that he had zero confidence in Canada's readiness for emerging technology threats like AI and quantum computing. Now, in your experience with your work in Canada, how ready do you think we are with respect to that statement?
Not as ready as we need to be, but not at zero. So I would say that, unfortunately, it might vary a lot depending on which group you're looking at. So, for instance, the Canadian Cyber Centre, they're focusing on analytics and sharing of indicators of compromise and that sort of thing, where they could play a bigger role, and they probably will over time in terms of their capabilities and how that could be shared. There are other organizations, too, that have varying capabilities because they have different security technology deployed. So some of them would have Fortinet firewalls, and some other people will have, say, Checkpoint or Cisco firewalls. And some of those firewalls will have different kinds of capabilities enabled, and some of it's next generation and some of it's not. So unfortunately, there's a lot of variation in terms of what we can respond to. And you mentioned AI and machine learning. and quantum. So as the attacks become more sophisticated, we do need to have more sophisticated countermeasures on scale. And that's why I was talking about the use of public cloud. For the financial sector, if it was run from a common place, that more advanced capability would be there for almost everybody that was connected to that source. That's one way of bringing the level up for everyone.
So Canada, and I guess the world for that matter, is said to have major gaps in talent with respect to cybersecurity. So what is your group doing to try and develop more talent? And how are you investing, and where are you investing in skills and target groups that would be, this is certainly an emerging field.
Yes, that's at the core of what is very important to ADGA. So ADGA is led by a female CEO, and we're very proud of that and our proud Canadian history and diversity as well. Invest heavily in co-op programs and bringing people in that are emerging in their skills to get them into cybersecurity, because that's what we're talking about today, but also other fields as well. There's a lot of work we all play. So recruiting is a function we can get involved in at the university and college level. We can help with the actual programs that they're taking. So SISC, for instance, at the Algonquin College, they have a very good program on cybersecurity, and there are a number of cybersecurity parts that are being built out now at the university level as well, and that's just here in Ottawa. And we take an active role in that, and we work with other colleges as well. So it's important to purposely recruit diverse talent and diverse skills, and have a big diverse, I guess, population in terms of the people you have. We in Canada have to make sure we maintain that talent. So keeping people excited and energized about the work is all of our responsibility. If there's a lot of cyber work this year but none next year, where does all the talent go?
So we had a gentleman here last week, I believe, from Ryerson, and some could argue that there might be some gaps in what they're going to try and roll out as far as their academic program. But does your group or industry like your group sit down with educational institutions and help them develop curriculum that's going to help develop the type of employees and the skill sets that you want coming out of our schools?
Yes, we actually have that opportunity. So I've been involved in actually giving feedback to Algonquin's program in the past, and there's Willis College we've talked to. They have a year program, and we've given feedback. I've given feedback on how much cybersecurity is in there and what should be in there. The Government of Canada security clearances they should get for their students as they go through, which will enable them to have better careers and stay in Canada. And we have influenced, and we do work with the universities, the programs. There are programs like, for instance, all the engineering students, and we regularly meet with these groups, and we're directly involved. So we do get an opportunity with the faculties in academia to set those agendas.
Can you explain, or if there is any, a difference between cybersecurity in the defense sector and cybersecurity in the IT sector, or is there even a difference?
Well, I can think of a few key differences, and one of them is I know that it's like a dam bursting. In cybersecurity and defense, they are just waiting to move from what's called defense to active defense to cyber offense as the legislation gets moved forward, because it's a critical enabler. It's now seen, cyber is seen as a whole new area of just like having naval or air force, it's its own theater of combat. So it's pretty critical that we move that legislation forward so that defense, that national defense can do more on the cyber landscape. Because as they deploy troops and they're in a theater of operations, they actually you can win and lose battles now based on cyber. So that's one difference. They're held back a little bit, and they also have a whole bunch of classified networks and other elements that all have to be brought forward, and that has to do with funding and large changes that are being looked at right now. In the private sector, there aren't as many rules. So you will see the large vendors being able to gather, we talked about cyber threat intelligence earlier. They're able to get that data across the world and from nodes that they have in different countries because they are it's less restrictive for them on how they operate. And that's actually very positive because then they're able to share that data with government and industry.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Mr. Dubé, 6 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for being here. I wanted to go back to the labor issue that was raised by my colleague and just look at a different aspect of it as well. And is there any do you get hamstrung by the fact that, or does the industry get hamstrung by the fact that when it comes to security clearances based on things like where people are from and things of that nature? Because for procurement, I mean, you're involved in procurement because on the cyber side, but for what I don't know if this is the correct term, but traditional procurement, so the actual building of, fighter jets or helicopters and what have you, military equipment, there have been issues in the past where, depending on where our allies are at on a particular issue, where we're at maybe even on a particular issue, different companies have been disqualified and missed out on the fact that, they have highly qualified people working there and perhaps the ideal equipment to serve, say, Canada's military, but the U.S. has an issue with a particular country or something like that. Are you seeing this issue play out in the same way in the cyber field? And if so, what can we do to address that?
Yes, we are seeing that issue. So for commercial clients, they're much more flexible. If your company has the right reputation, if you have the right people and skills, you can get those cyber engagements. We do a lot of security assessments, design, cloud security work, and so the message and what you're able to do with the commercial sector, and it's very sizable in Canada, is much more straightforward. It is a challenge. I have lots of security clearances. It's been simpler for me. But for others, if they don't have enough residency in Canada, they can't get the security clearance. And typically secret is required for most things. It can be top secret, but reliability isn't often the requirement. And so because you need, I think, 5 to 10 year residency in Canada and often to be a Canadian citizen, it might be good to look at mechanisms on how we could also do other security checks that would get people to secret and how we can make it much more uniform. There's probably no reason that every government department needs its own clearance process, its own rules. If you're trusted, you're trusted. And if the company's trusted, it's trusted. So probably these are things that could be reformed over time. And we probably should look at other ways to clear individuals. We have a bit of a brain drain in Canada. We should be recruiting talent from other countries, and as we get it here, we need to be able to get those people busy and onto important projects, and still give comfort to the government and banking that they have the right clearance, the right background.
So I appreciate that. In keeping with this issue, then, is there a particular issue for cyber though, where you look at in the military, let's say, let me back that up. If you're a company that's building helicopters, you're not selling helicopters to the Department of Finance. You're selling them to D&D. However, if you're operating in cybersecurity, finance needs cybersecurity as much as D&D does. So is there an issue there even where our traditional sort of military alliances make it easy to cut off people for security clearance when it comes to traditional military procurement, but it's more challenging is there an issue where if you're involved in cybersecurity for the Department of Finance, let's say, and you're using a company that has skills coming from people who might not be recognized on the defense side. Do you see what I'm getting at? Because you mentioned security clearances are different. So as Canadians, are we losing out on having proper protections, say, for the finance department because we're applying the same rules we would apply in defense because we're trying to create that uniformity? Where the alliances might be different and how it plays out in terms of, who cares what the Americans have to say if we're protecting the Department of Finance, for example, unlike military where we actually have an alliance with them.
I don't think there's the discrepancies the issue. I think what the issue is time. So now you're losing a year or 2 years sometimes before you can get key people in on engagements. And some of this cyber knowledge you could take a group of people. I think we've talked about how people can be accelerated, and it's been there's been witness testimony on it, how we can get people started quite quickly into cybersecurity, entry-level positions, others. If you have a key group of people that then you can clear, based on adding some people that are trusted from companies. And sometimes you need subject matter experts, let's say from the US. So comparable clearances and moving quickly on it. This is fundamental. So sometimes what happens is it's more about the time that we lose because of all these different clearances. And that the impact that is direct impact to national defense and to other groups that can't get teams meaningfully started for a year or two sometimes. Department of Finance might not require as many clearances. D&D requires what's also called a VCR at each site, but other entities don't do that. So it's about having the same standards applied to everyone. If the data is more sensitive, that's what the clearance should be for everyone.
Just really quickly, with the 20 seconds I might have left, I'm just wondering do you believe that we shoehorn ourselves, or pigeonhole ourselves rather, too much by looking at sort of the traditional alliances in terms of some of countries that are comparable to Canada that might have the expertise, but because they're not part of sort of the traditional paradigm that we look at, we're maybe missing out on some of that talent? Say like
yes and no. Okay. I think we can go to the Five Eyes community and get a lot of that talent and have comparable clearances. But yes, we should also look at extending to other countries. So how do we have a fast track clearance process so we can trust individuals for information from other countries? And how can we do it quicker?
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. Interesting, the analyst here whispered in my ear said, that's exactly one of the big problems. It's just getting those clearances. Because you're whispering in my ear. Yeah. Mr. Picard, 6 minutes, please.
Nice to see you again. You provide services to financial institutions, is that right?
Yes.
So when you, what was the comment you made about the fact that they would be the trusted company or service to be the guardian of those information or critical information? What was it again?
It's a really key point. I just didn't have enough time to go into it too much, so thank you for the opportunity. We all trust when we walk into a bank, and we all trust when we walk into Bank of Canada or one of these trusted Department of Finance. That is something that can be leveraged in a very positive way. So one of the things we talk about passwords. When you're setting up credentials online, the point you need to have is you have to be able to trust how you set that up. And I think we should be leveraging that space and those personas and organizations more. So that can establish more security to those online credentials. And it can play a broader role. It can be more uniform as well. So that's a key thing. We can set up stronger credentials that are more uniform that can be used in a more specific way for cybersecurity.
So doesn't that create an awkward situation where a bank would be the guardian of my critical information instead of the bank having access to a third party being responsible for those information, because you put the customer in a vulnerable situation where it has to deal with the bank being secure, of course, but at the same time, the objective of the bank is to make money and not to guard my information. And that put the customer in a weak situation before the bank.
So the main thing would be the bank would play a role called a registration authority. So the bank doesn't have to have the data. I think you've been briefed on tokenization. So the data wouldn't have to be held by the bank. The bank could be the enabler of saying, you are who you are. We know it. You've come into a bank. We trust you. You trust us. We've done a registration check. So it would be a function in support of setting up the online identity rather than holding the data.
Okay. You were quite positive about the former comments of AWS with centralized structure and kind of the iCloud type system where everything is at the same place. So does that mean that you, two things, does that mean that you support any initiative towards open banking where everything is the same place? And in the same time, we talk about those systems, centralized systems with such trust in their security that we don't feel the necessity to discuss about the insider job or human risk factor, and like it's not existent anymore.
So yes, I am in favor of using secure public cloud, and that would mean large data storage, but the ability then to detect attack when it's happening correctly and protect the data better. To protecting that data, there's lots of mechanisms that can be used. For example, there are good products for cloud that enable you at the field level to encrypt data whenever you need to. So if you have an insider threat and there's a breach, the data that's stolen is encrypted data. So it's protected because it was protected properly as you stored it. What we don't do a lot sometimes is organize our security design correctly so that when we're breached, we're not protected properly. We don't detect it fast enough, and we don't know how to respond. But if we organize ourselves, to your point, and there is an insider threat, the data can be protected, and we can more quickly detect and respond to the event too. One example is I'm sure everybody's aware of is Snowden. He was actually had a lot of access and then was able to give himself more access. That's not exactly the paradigm you want to have in an environment. There's ways of doing that better.
I'll let the rest of my time to Mr. Graham.
Mr. Graham.
Thank you. Mr. Drennan, in the 3 minutes that Ms. Ricard has been asking questions, I logged into a server and using raw SMTP sent myself an email from godheaven.org. And I think this brings to a big part of your spearfishing discussion. Why is it that we are still using protocols that are completely hackable like that? Like there's no authentication whatsoever in SMTP. I can put any spoof address that I want. SMTP SSL is not universal, but doesn't prevent spoofing in any case. So is there a role for, say, PGP signing our emails as a standard, or is there something that we can do to cryptographically sign? Is that an approach we should be looking at? Because for whatever reason, that has not taken off in the 25 years it's been around.
Probably because, and I'm speaking from some firsthand experience, PKI can be a bit of a big hammer, so public key infrastructure, so actually deploying certificates, and then what assurance of certificates are you deploying, and are they proprietary? S-MIME was very good, but I think the point is there are ways of establishing identity and having digital certificates or proof of the message originator and who sent it, and if it's been tampered with, that can be added and done better. So absolutely, there are technologies. If we standardized on one, that would be good. I don't know if we need full public key infrastructure, so I think we have to be careful about what digital certificate approach we take for, given the massive community that would be involved in the financial community.
What system would you suggest we use to authenticate? Because email is the greatest source of all of our vulnerabilities as far as phishing and so forth. So what should we use? What do you use?
Well, we're moving away from email. So I think that's more for productivity reasons. Email is not necessarily being used for what it was created for. So there are things like Slack and other tools that can create more efficient conversations. So I also think we have to, we talked about user awareness before. People need to know how to use email and what to click on. Just because everything's encrypted doesn't mean a bad actor didn't send an encrypted email to you. So it still comes down to that point. But there are ways to do it. If we wanted to have a portal service where there would be secure emails kept in a location that you could pull down, that would be an option. There's time to live encryption so that when you send messages, they're encrypted, and then if you don't open it fast enough, it expires and disappears. So there are some options to look at.
Thank you.
Signatures
Thank you, Mr. Graham. I have 4 minutes left. Any in the Conservative, Mr. Glinsky, do you want to use 4 minutes?
I'm a little, you were talking about security along with Mr. Dubé there. Your company, which works a lot with many government agencies, what security level do you look at for your people, or do you have to get them a secret or a top secret level?
So in our cybersecurity team, so in the organization, we actually have a lot. We have the ability to hold and process top secret information. We have classified environments. We all get top secret and these extra clearances we were just talking about. We do that because it enables us to be able to do the contracts we were talking about earlier. So we know we have to do it. So it actually affects, though, who we can hire as well. And that's an unfortunate byproduct because we want to always get as much diversity as we can. But we get all the top clearances for sure. And there's some other parts that go with it called
you
FOCI.
seem to be a little on the negative side. There seems to be a lot of, I used to do top secret investigations for security clearances. And there's a lot of work involved in them. But do you think that we should be reducing our level or our standard?
No, creating more consistency.
More consistency?
So all government departments can have the same clearance. So if an entity or a person is trusted to a level of information or a caveat of information, they should be trusted equally whatever place they go to. They shouldn't need different clearances for different organizations inside of Canada.
National standard with a national set of rules that you have to meet to get to a certain level. Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
And one quick, I think I got about 2 minutes left.
Yep.
You spoke briefly about artificial intelligence. And I've studied that in a couple different committees other than this, but do you think in time, artificial intelligence will be able to do cybersecurity better than we can do it personally ourselves right now?
I think the interesting way to look at artificial intelligence, hopefully it's not one of those bad movies that we've seen. I think how I'd like to look at artificial intelligence and the way I've seen it being deployed now is it can assist the operators. So when you have a security operations center and you have operators that are very hard to recruit, build, and keep, and you only have so many of them, they can make it a lot easier by reducing the data sets that you need to deal with and pre-making decisions, populating and making it very easy for you to make key decisions. So if you think of them as cyber assistants to help you get through all the terabytes of data and make your job easier, more focused, that's the way I think artificial intelligence, machine learning is at its best for cyber.
I want to feed them so much.
You can feed them everything, just don't let them press the button on everything.
Okay, with that, we are adjourned, and I just want to thank Mr. Drennan on behalf of the committee for a very fascinating period of time of discussing things that pretty well Mr. Graham is the only one understood. So, again, thank you again. Yes. Meeting adjourned, and colleagues, we're going to re-empanel the subcommittee, re-empanel in 2 minutes, and we're going to hope that the